Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
The Conservatives with the Liberal Democrats stole this money from those women who were born in the 1950s. It's completely unacceptable, and millions of women have been plunged into poverty and don't just want handouts by Social Security. They want their money back, and quite rightly so. They should be feeling angry about what the government did, and we will right that injustice, because justice is a price worth paying.
Angela Rayner speaking in 2019 in support of women seeking pension equality, the group known as Waspi, but it turns out the price was too high. So how much trouble does that cause for Labour? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock. Happy Christmas, Stephen. And I think one final gift that the Labour government have managed to give to themselves is the ire of yet another demographic. Like you said, the so-called Waspi women, that's women against state pension inequality. Now, they have been campaigning for years, arguing they weren't given enough warning when the pension age for women was brought into line with men. Now, look, a court has said no law has been broken, but the big news was an independent review into the civil service says there was a case of paying each person up to £3,000 because they weren't given notice. Labour yesterday rejected that. Now, the resulting fury is not just about the case, but, as you heard there from Angela Rayner, that politicians, Labour politicians, had promised them positive action. And it wasn't just Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister. Many others also supported the Waspi campaigners in the past, including the Prime Minister himself. He called the plight of the Waspi women a real injustice just 2 years ago in an interview.
Look, for many voters, this is just going to be held up as another example of a promise broken by Labour now that they're in government. Think of the plans to scrap the two-child benefit cap called for by Keir Starmer before he was Prime Minister, but then had to backtrack on the idea after the election, saying they couldn't afford to do it right now. And this seems to be the mantra that we hear over and over again. There just isn't the money. Now, the public finances tell us that that's true, but is this more than just campaigning and poetry and governing in prose, and can Labour afford to alienate another key group of voters after the winter fuel allowance debacle earlier this year?
Joining us now for more on the story is Bloomberg's Associate Editor Ailbhe Rea. Ailbhe, this year we've seen the Post Office inquiry, we've seen infected blood, we've seen these big government payouts for state wrongs. What makes the Waspi women different?
I guess the initial thing is that, yes, you were both right to point out that Labour politicians have in the past expressed their support for the Waspi women. But actually, by the time of the election campaign, they had quietly come off that promise, and there was no mention in the Labour manifesto of compensating these women. And actually, kind of across politics, no one really thinks that this is affordable. Well, you can find some Labour backbenchers or sort of individual MPs who make the case, but there's no party making the case for it. The Ombudsman's recommendations would cost about £10.5 billion, and the Conservatives didn't introduce that when they were in government before the election. Labour aren't going to after. So I think that there is a sense that this is a little bit different compared to those big payouts that you've mentioned, James.
I mean, this is a pretty difficult one to pull back on. I mean, obviously, financially, as you say, the argument has been made in one way, and it would be a large amount of money if the compensation was followed through on what was recommended by the Ombudsman. But politically, I wonder, I mean, is this too much of a I suppose denial from Labour in government, even if they had dropped it out of their manifesto before the election?
It's a tricky one. So as you say, the Waspi women, these are women who were born in the 1950s, who were kind of caught off guard by changing the state pension age from 60 to 65. So they would argue that they've been sort of left with 5 years less of a pension than they were expecting, and they're sort of entitled to that money back. The Ombudsman found that about 90% of women were aware of that change coming. But, the government did apologise and said that it hadn't been communicated properly by past governments. So they've been campaigning for a very long time. And if you work around Westminster, you can see that they are some of the most effective campaigners around. The reason that all of these Labour politicians have been photographed with these placards with Waspi women saying, I pledge to support the Waspi women, is because they are, amazing operators, present at every single party conference, really, really present around Westminster. They sort of forge these links with their Labour MPs, and the Labour MPs from really every party feel quite a big obligation to represent them. But I think that it just actually for a long time quietly, I'm going to say something controversial, but I think quietly around politics, people have acknowledged for a long time that this is not where money should be going, and that actually a lot of these women, the ombudsman found most of them would have been aware in advance. But actually, when you sort of look at the spread of inequality in the UK, the kind of the groups that are more likely to be in poverty, it tends not to be this group. So for all sorts of reasons, actually Labour, the Conservatives, even Reform, aren't kind of making the case for this. But it's tricky because you have this back catalogue of times when MPs in opposition did say that this was an injustice.
And you paint this picture really well there, Alf, of this kind of almost lose-lose situation for Labour. Give the money out, there'll be questions about taxes and where the money's going to come from. That's a lot of money after a very difficult budget. And the other way, as we're seeing at the moment, is this kind of outrage. But then I think the other issue that's with this story is it tacks on to 6 months where the big accusation levelled at Labour is they didn't plan for government well enough. Do you think that sort of a lot of the anger around this story is tied into this idea that Labour didn't really prepare for power?
Well, I think that part of the problem is this, it's alienating yet another group after, fewer than 6 months in government. So the Waspy women are just the latest, but this comes on top of another change that will really hit pensioners this winter, which is, of course, cutting the winter fuel allowance, which was like the first big thing that Labour announced in government. Rachel Reeves said that she had to do that because she was facing a fiscal shortfall that year. So, essentially she didn't have enough money immediately and needed to make an immediate change, which meant that, only a few weeks into government, before they really announced anything else, before they held a budget, she just announced this change, taking away support for pensioners with their heating bills, leaving it means tested. So the very, very poorest pensioners will still get it, but lots will miss out, including some people that critics say are still vulnerable and will actually, will be at risk of going cold this winter and not being able to afford their bills as a result. So I think there's this big sense that Labour has betrayed pensioners and doesn't care about frail old people freezing in their homes, the way critics would put it. But I think then, after the budget, we've seen a big outcry from business about the massive tax increases levied on them. Then, in particular, farmers, with these changes to inheritance tax around Westminster, we've just seen constant protests from farmers, tractors outside Big Ben, but like banging their horns every week practically. So there are quite a few groups that have been alienated, and then overall, all Labour's polling position has just kind of collapsed. Their approval ratings have really, really slumped. And I think it's something like 70% of Britons have said that they're dissatisfied with Keir Starmer, according to one poll carried out at the end of last month. So this is just sort of another group that's been alienated by them. Labour was probably always going to do this, but they don't have much political capital left in the bank, really.
Yeah, well, I suppose that leads us to and how, first of all, at what point does this chorus of protest, who breaks through when everyone just seems generally quite unhappy? And the second point is this just normal for a government that's taken over at a very difficult time, that things were always going to be hard and they just sort of need to get through it and hope that by the time the next election rolls around, things will have improved? I
think that within Number 10, that's definitely the hope. They would say that they have done difficult things and weathered them because I've put this to them. They say that they have enough time to turn things around. They just have to make certain difficult decisions, own them, and people will forget before the next election. And their priorities just need to be delivering on those things, like improving living standards, building more homes, clean energy, those kinds of things that they've said are their priorities. But it is quite tricky. I mean, the Waspy women thing was kind of probably inevitable, but in a way, like Labour doesn't have much political capital in the bank to spend on this because they burned through it really quite quickly. And you remember over the summer, the freebie scandal about Keir Starmer and other members of the cabinet taking gifts and hospitality worth thousands of pounds. So I think there is a hope among Labour MPs that it turns around next year, because it doesn't feel like it's been going very well. And just to mention a little bit on like the nature of the backlash from the Waspy women, lots of, it's the same critics really from within Labour and outside it who've been critical of things like the winter fuel payment cut and the two-child benefit cap. So, Labour MPs have been standing up in Parliament to criticise their own government. And some of them are sort of from the Corbynite left, and you might expect that, people like John McDonnell or Diane Abbott or Rebecca Long-Bailey. But there are some other people like Melanie On or newer MPs who've also stood up and criticised this decision, which is a bit more unusual because they're not from that wing of the party necessarily. And then you've also had Anas Sarwar, the leader of Scottish Labour, who has said a similar thing. And, this happens quite a bit, that he needs to take a slightly different line to the Labour leader in Westminster. He often tacks a little bit to Keir Starmer's left for a slightly different electorate in Scotland. But, he's again just had to distance himself from what the UK government is doing. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the mayors from the Labour Party in London or in Manchester also ended up criticising this decision. So it's just pretty uncomfortable. And, that clip that you played at the beginning of Angela Rayner expressing her support for the Waspy women, we've got clips from Keir Starmer in 2022. And Rachel Reeves campaigned with her own mother against... or in favour of compensation for the Waspy women. It is just really, really tricky. And I think that probably what's been lost for them is that this wasn't a promise that they made right before the election and then came in and broke. They actually weren't really promising this. It was years ago that they were supporting the Waspy women.
And the expectation was so high for them when they got into government. Ailbhe, thanks so much for joining us, our Associate Editor Ailbhe Rea there. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more in the new year. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.